There is a study, you've probably heard it referenced, about how men apply for jobs when they meet about 60% of their requirements. Women, they wait until they hit closer to 100. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately, not just in the context of job applications, but in the context of who starts companies, who raises their hand and says, I think I can build something worth millions. Because here is what I know, the confidence gap is real. And today I want to talk about what happens downstream from that gap. When it meets venture capital, well, it meets grant committees, when it meets a spreadsheet of 219 funded Nordic companies. Welcome, let's get into the data. Real people, real stories, and real challenges that break the status quo. I'm your host, Živile, and welcome to Perception Paradox. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Perception Paradox. And today's episode is inspired by a report called Funded, published in 2026 by E133, one of the largest incubators for female founders in the Nordics. They tracked every company co-founded or led by women that raised funding across Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Iceland in 2025. In total, it's 219 companies, 5 countries, hundreds of millions of euros. And the picture they paint is both more hopeful and more sobering than I expected. So I'm going to walk you through the data, the headlines, the surprises, and the thing buried in the middle of the report that I think is the most important finding of all. And if you're wondering why did I decide to do this solo episode out of the blue and go back again into the female funding data, so there are 2 reasons for that. Okay, maybe 3. First of all, this topic is very close to my heart. And sometimes I catch myself also limiting myself from taking some decisions. 5 years ago during COVID in 2020, together with my co-founders, we organized Women Innovation Sprint between Nordic Baltic countries because I do recall the funding data and reports were simply terrible. Now the things are changing, the results are getting better, but I think it's important to revisit and to bring that topic. Then secondly, I had a chance to join the podcast with a young founder, and this whole podcast is focused on the Gen Z generation. So we were 3 women in conversation, and this young founder, she's building something great in the robotics field, and she was sharing how she has to transform being in the rooms with venture capitalists and how sometimes she would not be taken seriously, and her co-founder, who is a male, would be considered as a main spokesperson. And thirdly, which is more like an example, a funny example from the real life scenario, right? How differently we evaluate ourselves as well as genders. And then the third situation was quite funny. So I was looking for someone to play tennis with, and I posted my level and everything. And then I've got a response from one of the group members, and then we met and everything. So I was laughing. That was a great example. He was like, yeah, I had to Google a bit the levels, but I think I'm your level as well. And which was not fully the case. And I was like, yeah, okay, sure. That's how differently we're owning those stories. So, and you might be wondering, why did I bring these topics now back? I think it's very important to keep the pulse on the track and to see the progress. 5 years ago, I launched Nordic Baltic Women Innovation Sprint with my co-founders, where we were tackling that underrepresentation of women when it comes to startups, and we're bringing more women from corporate to entrepreneurship. And secondly, I also participated a couple of weeks back in the Pitch Lab podcast, where it's all about the Gen Z founders. And there was a very smart and clever Gen Z female entrepreneur who is building in robotics. And she was mentioning the challenges she's facing as a female founder in robotics, how sometimes they have strategically put her male co-founder on stage, or how being in the same room, her co-founder would be considered to be as the main guy and all that thing. So I thought it's really important to bring out some data when I saw this report out there. So yeah, let's start with the top line. So in 2025, women founded and co-founded companies across the Nordics raised in total 707 million euros. And that sounds enormous, right? But it is if you include Aura, the Finnish health tech company behind those rings everyone is wearing on their hand, which closed the 790 million euro Series E. Including Aura, total tracked funding actually hits 1.5 billion euros. But the researchers made a smart call. They report Aura separately because one company of that scale would warp the entire dataset. So when we say 707 million euros, we are talking about the actual day-to-day funding landscape for women-founded companies. Now, here's a breakdown by country. Sweden led with 404 million euros, which is 57% of all tracked funding. Finland came in second with 148 million euros and notably the highest average deal size in the region at 6.2 million euros per round. Denmark raised 122 million euros, Norway 28 million euros, and Iceland 4.4 million euros. Sweden is basically gravitational center of this ecosystem at the moment. More companies, more capital, more everything. But Finland is quietly doing something interesting. Fewer deals, but bigger ones. We will come back to that later. And the whole pipeline grew. In 2024, the same research tracked 152 companies. In 2025, 219. That's a 44% increase in the number of women-founded companies raising money. So more founders, more deals, more momentum. Except total funding went down from 906 million euros in 2024 to 707 million euros in 2025. More founders raising into a tighter market. So keep that in mind, and I think it's a very important detail. Now we go to the part that matters most. Of those 219 companies, 57 were founded entirely by women, no male co-founders. That's 26% of the total pipeline. Those 57 companies raised a combined 73 million. Mixed gender teams where at least one founder is male raised 553 million. Let's say that again so it lands properly. Women-only teams represent 26% of the companies in this data set, but they received 10% of the capital. Mixed teams raised 7.5 times more in total. The average per deal gap is 2.8 times. Now, here's where it gets interesting because even founders did something I really appreciate. They didn't just say that the gap exists, they went digging for why. And what they found flips the narrative. When you compare women-only teams and mixed teams at the same funding stage, the gap almost disappears. At pre-seed level, women-only teams actually raise more than mixed teams. At seed level, the gap is under 10%. So the issue isn't that women can't raise. The issue is that women-only teams are concentrated at the earliest stages. Grants, pre-seed, while mixed teams are progressing to seed and Series A. The report calls this the growth stage cliff. Women are entering the funding funnel. They are not moving through it at the same rate. And here is the starkest data point. In 2025, 0 women-only founding teams reached Series B. Every single Series B in this data set went to a mixed gender team. There is a pattern in this data that I want to spend a minute on because it's subtle but significant. So women-only founders are increasingly dependent on grants. In 2024, 13% of women-only funding rounds were grants. In 2025, that jumped to 25%, nearly double. So for mixed teams, the same figure went from 8% to 12%. So both groups are relying more on grants, but women-only founders are relying on them much more. Now, grants aren't inherently bad. Non-dilutive capital is real capital, but here is the problem. Not all grants are equal. So mixed teams receive grants averaging 1.16 million euros per grant. Women-only teams receive grants averaging 0.35 million euros per grant. That's 3 times less. 3 times less. Within the same funding category. So what's happening in this? Women-only founders are accessing smaller support program grants, the kind designed specifically for underrepresented founders, while mixed teams are winning the larger public innovation grants, the EU-level funding, the industry grants, and so on. Even when the door is open, the rooms are different sizes. Let's talk about what these founders are actually building, because this is the part of the report that I find really exciting. By deal count, the top sectors are biotech, in total 28 companies. We do have SaaS 20 and AI 18. By capital, deep tech leads at 182 million euros, largely driven by Einride, an autonomous freight company in Sweden, whose founder Linnea Kornhed-Falk raised 132 million euros in a combined Series B, the largest single round in the dataset. Tech is described in the report as the most encouraging major sector. It has the broadest pipeline and meaningful women-only representation. 6 of the 28 biotech companies are women-only founded. Femtech is the number one sector for women-only founders by deal count. 10 companies and 8 of those 10 are women-only founded. Makes sense. Founder market fit is real. But here is something the data surfaces that I think is important. Women-only founders are no longer just building in traditionally female-coded sectors. They are in biotech, health tech, fintech, AI, SaaS. The sector spread in 2025 is broader than in previous years. So the exception, and it's a glaring one, is deep tech. Of the 14 deep tech companies in this data set, 0 have women-only founding teams. 0. It's the only major sector with no women-only representation at all, and it's also the highest capital sector. The report makes a point that I think it's worth repeating. You can't fix this at the investment stage. The pipeline problem in deep tech starts earlier in the science and engineering pathways, in the labs, in the PhD programs. Investment alone can't close gap that forms 20 years before the pitch deck is written, right? And we've been seeing these patterns also when it comes to engineering. And it's not something new. And the data is quite sad. So I want to end with what I think is the most important insight in the entire report. Even founders tracked a fourth category of companies, ones with male founding teams, but a woman in the CEO role, 20 companies in total. So those 20 companies raised an average of 4.27 million euros per round, nearly identical to mixed gender founding teams. Women-only founding teams raised an average of 1.67 million euros per round. The report's conclusion is that women who lead raise as much as mixed team. Women who found raise 2.8 times less. The gap is not really at the leadership stage, it's at formation. And this matters because it reframes where intervention needs to happen. And it's not just about getting more women into boardrooms or C-suites. It's about what happens when two people sit down and decide to start a company together. Who gets invited into that room? Who gets taken seriously? And who picks up the phone to call an investor first? So where does this leave us? 219 companies, 707 million euros, a pipeline that grew by 44% in a single year. The women are there, they're building, they are raising. And when you put them on the same playing field, same stage, same sector, they raise just as much. The problem is they are not making it to the same stage. Back to where we started, that confidence gap, that tendency to wait until you are 100% ready. I don't think it's only about the confidence. I think it's about the signals you receive from the world around you, about whether you belong in that room at all. And the data says you do, you always did. So if you want to read the full Even Founders Funded 2025 report, I'll leave the link in the show notes, and it's free and it's full of kind of information that should be required reading for anyone who writes checks, sits in the committee, or is deciding whether to start something. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this type of episode and with a bit of more data than usually. And see you next week.